I think that we need to understand and we need to let our children experiment and exercise their curiosity. And I think that you can encourage your children to look at the different aspects of what they're doing. I'll tell you, if you will, my little secret, the one question I always asked myself, and the one question I always tell young people who consult with me to ask themselves is not just what does this next opportunity give me, but what doors does this open for me for the next opportunity after that?
Namaskar and welcome to another episode of the Professor Mahesh Podcast, your resource to help you make informed career decisions. As we like to think, this is your future simplified. This podcast is brought to you by the Office of Global Engagement and specifically IIT Madras Global. IITM Global is an initiative that is there to take everything IIT Madras and everything India to the world audience, our innovation, our research, our thinking, our education, our philosophy broadly. Come learn more about their efforts in the link in the description below. Innovation drives economies to greatness. There is absolutely no question about this. If there is one country that has made innovation a centerpiece of their growth story over the last several decades, and if there is one country that has made its mark technologically globally, it is Israel. We're going to learn a few tips out of the Israel playbook, and to help us understand how the innovation ecosystem works in Israel, both in the universities and outside the universities to some extent, to help us understand the Israel playbook and to help us with gaining some insights into how we can adapt some of their winning strategies to Indian academic institutions. I am delighted to be hosting Ms. Nava Swersky Sofer. Nava has been for a very long time embedded in the Israel innovation ecosystem and continues to lead several important institutions for the country sitting on their boards. Nava, it's a delight to be having this conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Mahesh, for the opportunity to speak to you, to your future students, your current students, and most importantly, as a parent myself, to their parents.
Wonderful. That's, you already picked up that students and parents in India work very closely in, understanding where careers should go. Let's start with your own childhood, your own sort of training and what got you into this whole realm. You are a lawyer by training.
That's true. Nobody's perfect. But I started out as a lawyer, which was really a decision I made at a very young age. I graduated from high school when I was 16. And in Israel, we have conscription for both men and women. So typically, you graduate from high school at 18, you go straight into your military service for a few years, and you only go to university after that. For me, it was a little different because I was too young to go into the military at 16. So I went to study, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. But I come from a family with many lawyers, and many lawyers who don't practice law as well.
Okay.
And who've taken that into the business world. And I thought, well, it's a good start. It's a good education. In retrospect, I was right, but I couldn't have known that at the time. And that's how I ended up studying law. And I did practice for a few years, commercial law, and then that's what I did in my military service as well, in the Judge Advocates Division. And then I moved on and out from the legal world into the business world.
And in the business world, have you always been sort of embedded in this space of intellectual property management, or did you don other roles early on?
I moved into the business world through an MBA. That's always a very good way, and I think you have many, many engineers here.
Yes.
There were many engineers at business school with me because typically we come from a discipline. It can be law, it can be finance, it can be engineering, whatever. And if you want to move into general management, and especially global general management, which is where I was going, you need that broader business education, and that's what I did. And I ended up I thought I was going to do what lawyers with MBAs do, which is usually either management consulting or investment banking.
Yeah.
And I did get offers from very well-known firms in those areas. And then I got an offer that was very strange to me at the time from what was then SIBA, it's now Novartis, one of, at the time, the top 3 pharmaceutical companies in the world. And they wanted to speak to me. I said, listen, I don't speak German. This was the head office in Basel, Switzerland. I don't know anything about pharmaceuticals, and I don't want to live in Switzerland. Okay, fast forward a few years. I speak a fluent German. I know a whole lot about pharmaceuticals, and I lived in Switzerland for 5 years. So I guess my first tip would be never say never. And you really don't know where things will take you. And I found myself in a very senior management role and eventually in the management forum of the global organization with global responsibilities. And it was an amazing hands-on business school. I already had an MBA, but this was where I learned about big global business and what makes it tick, how you make things happen. It was also, in retrospect, my first foray into innovation. Because Pharma is an innovation-driven business, and we were pioneers of bringing in external innovation, understanding that it doesn't all happen in-house and that you need to reach out to small companies, to startups, to use venture capital as an avenue to gain access to innovation. So again, in retrospect, it was a very good first step in the global business world. And it happened to me, I have to say, quite by chance, but I'm very glad it did.
I think the 2 takeaways from what you just said for me, you used the word learn a couple of times. You learned German, but you also learned how global businesses work.
Absolutely.
That's an absolutely important part of any job that young men and women should aspire to have a very serious learning component in there. And sometimes we underestimate that, the importance of that vis-a-vis the actual paycheck that reaches our bank account.
I couldn't agree more. And I'll take that one step further. I am a huge believer in lifelong learning. I think we learn all the time. And I think that when we allow ourselves the mental and intellectual flexibility of learning new things, making career changes, we expand our own offering to the business world and to the world of work. And we also open up avenues that may not have been there before. Because you and me, we went to school when nobody would conceive of AI, right?
Yes. Or even a computer.
Or even a computer or a smartphone or any of the things that we take for granted today. Now, to make us flexible enough and useful in the workplace, we need to maintain that openness of mind, that desire to learn. Really what it is to be curiosity driven. So I'm a very big believer in that, and I think that's something that students should remember. They don't finish learning when they graduate from university.
Absolutely.
It's just the beginning.
It is just the beginning. Let's talk about your, another foray of yours that came downstream of Pharma, venture capital world. You started a women-only venture capital firm. Did I do my research right?
You did your research right. Yes, I'm impressed. I first moved into venture capital. Well, it was through the pharmaceutical industry. I was sent over to California to start a fund on behalf of SIBA. I will admit that I put that proposal together, and then went with that proposal. Ended up, long story, not very interesting, I think, for your listeners, but ended up becoming a partner in a firm that we had invested in, leaving the big company, becoming a partner in a venture firm, and spent the next 5 years living in San Francisco, working on Sand Hill Road, which is, if you will, the mecca of venture capital, and investing in early stage biomedical companies. When I moved back to Israel, which was after about 10 years in Europe and the States, I initially received many approaches, and you have to remember at the time Israel was less global than it is now, but I did receive several approaches to start local offices for international funds. And I thought that always makes you really the stepchild, you know. If a fund is located, say, in California, and it has one person sitting on the other side of the world, you're always going to be competing for funds and for attention. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was more appropriate to set up something that was focused on sourcing technology from the local market, and I could see that there was a lot of technology that was untapped. Mm-hmm. And I set out to build a team, and I looked for the best people I could find, and it so happened that the best people I found were all women. And so we were pioneers, but we were global pioneers. And it's not just a good story, but it also, in the end, we did very well. You know, the results were good. We were flexible. We did a lot of things then that people do now and talk about, you know, being flexible, leaving earlier, coming back to work online at night, you know, things that you do in order to make family and career work, but they work. So that was a very good experience for a good number of years.
You said you picked the best people who happen to be women. That's a very important message to highlight as well. Sometimes we get confused. We put the cart before the horse in some way. What was the philosophy? I mean, when did you really discover that you had actually built a women-only firm?
It actually wasn't until it came together. I really did not set out to make a bold statement in and of itself.
Sure.
And I was always, until then, the only woman in the room. I was the only woman in the top management of SIBA, what is now Novartis in Switzerland. I was the only woman at the venture firms handling in California. I was one of, I think it was still a single-digit number at the time of women partners in venture firms in general. On Sand Hill Road. It was a very male-dominated industry.
Sure.
And it still is an industry where, you know, you bring your friends, so it's very much an old boys network, and unfortunately still is. So I was used to it. I didn't maybe like it, but I was used to it. When I went out to look for talent, I'll tell you, this is my philosophy to this day. It's very silly to leave 50% of the talent pool out of your exploit. It's silly.
Yeah.
And women are 50% of the population. There are very good women. There are also very good men. But later, as CEO of Yissum, I did the same thing. When I had to find senior people, I just looked for the best people around and ended up with a balanced management team that I think the advantage of the diversity is you really get a broader set of opinions and a wider point of view.
Last question on that, if I may. Have you kept track of where they've all gone longitudinally since then? Have they?
Oh, yes. And they've all done very nicely. One is the CEO of a biomedical company on the West Coast, actually, moved to California. Another is very senior in the banking world, and so on. So, you know, people do well. And I think when you give people an opportunity in an area that they may not have thought of, I keep in touch with a big number of people who've worked with me in the past, former employees and others. I like to see them grow. And I consider them in the same way I do with many of my students. So I like to see that growth. And I think you can maybe relate to that as a professor yourself. You want to see people go above and beyond and really go make their mark in the world.
Wonderful, wonderful. And then you moved into the world of tech transfer and commercialization. Give us a high view, because we will dive deep into that space. What was the world like when you came in there?
I was approached, again, this happened quite by chance. By then I had young children, and I was approached by a headhunter. I said, this is absolutely not for me, but I think I can recommend someone. And I did. And they kept on coming back to me and said, would you please speak to the chairperson, and would you mind? I said, well, I can give advice, but long story short, I ended up taking the job. By the way, first woman, only woman to this day. I was replaced by a man and a series of men again after that. For no good reason, I have to say, because it's a business that is not particularly male or female. But when I took it on, honestly, I didn't really know what it entailed. I thought in my innocence that it would be an easier lifestyle than venture capital. I thought, you're working with the academic world, people don't work these very long hours. When, back in Israel, working in the venture capital space, you work a lot with the West Coast, the East Coast, Europe, the time difference, you're working in the middle of the night because of, it's not that easy. I thought this was going to be much easier. I was wrong. It wasn't much easier, but it was very, very interesting. I also thought that I knew this space because I had started so many early stage companies out of universities as a venture capitalist, as a manager. Again, interestingly, it's completely different from the other side of the fence. It doesn't look the same at all, even if you think you know the space. You have the advantage of understanding the other side. Very good advantage in doing deals. But you do need to go about it differently. There are sensitivities that I learned about and learned to navigate that were new to me.
We'll come to those sensitivities and the nuances of doing tech transfer in a university. Because at a high level, this is not a puzzle that has been cracked globally. So I want to get some insights from you. Before we go there, let's understand the Israeli innovation culture. I want to get your insider out view of what are some things that are working for this innovation ecosystem to be firing the way it is. Israel is often called a startup nation. Israel itself is a very young country, by some of the European global standards. What really, let's start with a high level view and then we'll dig deep. What are the few things that you think really work for the country?
Israel is a very small country. And because we punch above our weight, I think if you read global news, you'd think Israel was an empire because we're always in the news. We make a lot of noise, but it's a country of 10 million people and 23,000 square kilometers. It is
Chennai
tiny.
is bigger than that.
Chennai is bigger. Israel is smaller than Chennai population-wise, and it's not a whole lot bigger in terms of physical size. I think you may have been to Israel. It's a very small country. And it's important to understand that because you're working with, a limited pool of people. We're also, traditionally, we've been in a neighborhood where we haven't really had active land borders, okay? We've been locked in land-wise with countries that we didn't have for most of the time of Israel's existence. We didn't have diplomatic or commercial relations with. So everything you do has to be global-facing. That's one of the things I always mention. There are 8 points that I point to when I look at what makes the Israeli innovation ecosystem work. But one of them, for sure, is that our companies are born global. And it means that you're looking, at first glance, you're not creating a local company and then having to globalize it. You're creating a company, a technology, a business that looks at the world as its oyster, because it has to, because the country's too small. There's not enough local business. You can't have a truly large, successful company based only on local business. And traditionally, our main partner has been the US, so that is where people look to the most. There's work with Europe and a growing body of companies and people working with countries like India, also China, and so on. But traditionally, I'd say historically, we've worked a lot with the US, which also gives you access to capital and access to capital markets. The Israeli tech industry works in English. And unlike India, Israel doesn't work in English. Israel works in Hebrew, but the tech industry works in English, to the point that people send emails to each other, to Israeli employees, in English, because that is the language that you work in. You'll speak Hebrew, but you'll email in English. The minutes will be in English. The manuals will be in English. So that's part of this whole global outlook of the industry, and that's one component. But it comes from, necessity is the mother of invention. Sure. And that's very much the case in Israel. So it's a small country. It's basically fairly isolated in terms of its land activities. So you grow global companies. The second thing that happens is that because of Israel's situation, and I know this was something that you had expressed interest in, we have developed a very strong military capability, and we have conscription, which means everybody, men and women, have to serve in the military. Now, the military does two things. One is it develops technologies. We can get to that. But the second thing that I want to mention is it develops people. A young person who serves as, especially if they're in a command position or an officer or, you can do different things, but it develops a set of personal skills that is invaluable for life afterwards. Things like teamwork, things like thinking, solution-based work, working towards a solution, sometimes thinking outside the box, perseverance. All of those things come to you also from what you do within the military, taking responsibility. And that, again, means that we have people coming out of military service with a unique skill set. Another thing we have, and you also have, is a very strong academic system, a very strong system of universities, and a very big influence on education. In that respect, there's a lot of similarity between India and Israel.
Education at all social strata is a non-negotiable for their children. Mm-hmm. Would you say the same would be the case in Israel?
I would say pretty much. I'd say pretty much, and it certainly was the case. In this day and age, I find myself being engaged in discussions about do you or do you not need a university education because the world is moving in different directions. But certainly historically, I would agree with you.
Okay.
It's just something we do. And it's something that's been traditional for the Jewish people throughout the years, because after all, for 2,000 years, the Jews didn't have a country. Started in, where Israel now is. Then the Jews were in the diaspora. They were all over the world, but didn't have a country. So when you're in the diaspora, and you're also very often persecuted, and you have to move around, the only thing you can really take with you are your personal skills. And those personal skills are based on education. And that's why you saw throughout the centuries, the Jewish people were doctors, they were, lawyers, they were engaged in professions that could go with them. Rather than, say,
piano maker
or a piano maker, less mobile as a profession. So that I'd say the value of education, the value of universities, very, very important. It's another thing that we have, and we've enjoyed. This is in no particular order of the points, but another of the things we've enjoyed is smart government support. I know that's an unusual thing to hear from someone like myself, who's in the private sector.
Are you still associated with the Israel Innovation Authority?
I am.
You are, right?
I am, but I'm not saying it because of that. I am.
But you are a citizens representative.
I
there.
am on the boards of in these investment boards of the Israel Innovation Authority, which again is a very nice thing because
Sure.
it means that when the state makes decisions on who gets funding, they have people like me who are lay experts, if you will. Okay, so we're not government employees.
We'll underline that, lay expert. Nice phrase.
And we have to be there. You know, they can't
Sure.
actually hold a committee meeting if they don't have a minimal number of people like me. They can't make decisions with just government employees. It's the way it works. So you're getting real life input into this. But regardless of that, because Israel traditionally, how shall I put this gently, not very good at long-term planning. We tend to fly by the seat of our pants. And when you fly by the seat of your pants, you don't have things like 5-year plans, 2-year plans, long-term, strategic views. And that might have a disadvantage, but in the world of innovation, it also has an advantage. It means you can react fairly quickly to advantages, to opportunities, and to challenges in the marketplace, and have programs to address those on a relatively short notice. So we have had, I'll give you a good example that I was also partly involved with, nanotechnology. When nanotechnology was rising in the world, maybe 15 years ago, closer to 20, Israel created a specific program to support the creation of nano-centers, centers of nanotechnology in the leading research universities, to bring back to Israel scientists in those areas, because most Israeli scientists will go abroad for a postdoc, sometimes a PhD, but always a postdoc, and you wanted to bring them back and create a lab and grow the next generation of technologies to help support both academic excellence and also the commercialization of those technologies and their use by industry. So created a specific program, and they put some money behind it, and the universities had to raise the rest of the money from whatever donations or their own funds they created 6 technology centers, and those have given rise to a whole array of technologies in an area that probably would have developed, but certainly not as fast. So that's one example. There are programs to support multinational companies that want to open centers in Israel. Because again, maybe they'll do it, maybe they won't, but if they have a little nudge, they have a little push, they get some incentive, it helps them decide to be in Israel. So those sorts of things we've had. What we've also had as a result of the success over time is access to capital. Israel very fast became the place where there was more venture capital per capita than anywhere else in the world. And in absolute dollar terms, until I think that the highest was probably 22, but in absolute dollar terms, we, for many years, were the second largest in the world after the US. And again, access to capital is necessary in order to drive the system. So you put together all of these things, you end up with an entrepreneurial hotbed. By nature, we're an entrepreneurial people, okay? And again, once you've had some success, and this has been going on for a couple of decades, you also have second, third, fourth time entrepreneurs. So you have expertise in the system that makes it easier for investors to invest. After all, if a successful entrepreneur starts a new business, people line up to invest because they know here's someone who's done it and can do it again. And first-time entrepreneurs always more difficult.
Correct.
More difficult to get funding. So, but you have an ecosystem, and when I show it, when I talk about it with students and conferences, whatever, I show it as a sort of circle because it moves around. It doesn't really matter where on the circle each of these items is. They all have to be there in order for this wheel to turn, right? You're a mechanical engineer, so, for the cogs to turn,
Sure,
they have to be interrelated. And I think that's what we've succeeded in putting together over the years. And I would say if I had to point to one that is maybe the most important, it is that entrepreneurial spirit.
My view of innovation requires a third puzzle, which I've not heard you talk of. There's people. You talked about the people side. There is capital, money side. Problem statements and ideas. Is there something systemic that allows these people to sort of find problem statements?
I guess that I related to that in maybe not directly, but one is, the academic side, the development of technologies, and the other is this constant interaction with the global marketplace. Because after all, there are two ways of looking at this. One is the traditional university-based, we've found a great solution, let's go find a problem.
Exactly my problem.
Yeah, big issue. The world is full of great solutions for non-existent problems. The second is to go out and say, what does the world need? Now let's see if we have the right solution or we can develop the right solution for that. Those are typically the more successful entrepreneurial businesses. And it's what we all know as product market fit.
Yes.
Right? But that's really, and it's a big part of what we teach as well. Which begs a side question of, can you teach entrepreneurship? We can get there if you like. But I think a lot of that happens because when you have a vibrant industry, then you get exposed to the problems, to the challenges, to what's coming up next. They sort of present themselves. If you don't have a vibrant system, it's very hard to see them. You tend to sort of focus on your solution and the problem might have gone away.
So a young man somewhere, a young man or woman growing up in some, let's say, central Israel, how do they find this global problem? I mean, like, are there interaction fora that allow these young men and women to get visibility of these problems?
There are, and I think that all people, if they have that mindset, if they're looking to be exposed to challenges, technological and otherwise, can be exposed to those. After all, the entire world is right here in our hand. You've got your little. I can do an entire day's work with this. I can have access to all the information I want, to global forums, to really anything that I might think of. A lot of it, though, has to do, and it goes back to the people and the culture.
Yeah.
It's something that we look at all the time. We have innovation hubs today in all the universities and the colleges. It's talked about. It's we see it. And so it gets people thinking about, okay, how can I resolve this? Israelis, again, very broad generalization, they don't always like to follow orders. Certainly not if they don't understand why.
Yeah.
And they will typically ask questions.
Okay.
We ask a lot of questions. Sometimes they will try and find a way around what they're supposed to do. They will look for shortcuts. It can drive you up the wall. But on the other hand, it is the hallmark of curiosity and innovation and finding, why does it have to be this way? Maybe it can be that way. So that's part of the culture. And I think you've probably seen that because I know you've visited.
Well, I've seen it in Israel, and I see it I see what you're last describing all the time in India as well.
I was going to say that, we have, and I'm sure you've seen that research, and I'm happy to share it with you and your audience if you haven't, but there's a professor at Stanford who does a lot of research on innovation. Usually, he started out looking at unicorns, but then it was a lot of other components of innovation ecosystems. And one of the things he looked at was, where did the founders of US-based unicorns come from? Half of them, roughly, not born in the US.
Yeah.
Not surprising, right? Immigrants try harder. Of those, largest group, surprise, surprise, Israelis. The second largest group, not surprising, India. I see a lot of similarities. Certainly when you look at both Israelis, and Indian people as immigrants. You see that in the US at the top of all the big tech companies. I think it comes from the understanding that you have to have an appetite for risk. And with that goes the understanding that you have to have not really an appetite, because nobody wants to fail, but you have to have an understanding that failure is part of the game.
Let's talk about that. Is it culturally accepted that some 25-year-old woman decides to go solve a problem, 2-3 years later, they openly admit that I've moved on?
I don't think any of us likes to openly admit that we've failed. But it is accepted that it's part of the game.
Okay.
Now, sometimes people will make various excuses, okay? We were ahead of the game, the market doesn't understand, investment dried up, what have you. I've heard them all. There are about a list of 200 excuses. However, by the way, if you analyze them, and there is analysis of these on a global scale, not specifically for Israel, you will see that it mostly comes down to the point that you raised, which is product market fit. Because if you're not doing the right thing at the right time, for the right need, those things will not get aligned, you won't get funded. Because after all, when people say we couldn't raise funds, what it means is the world was not interested in funding what you were doing because it didn't think it was the right thing. But so I'd say yes, it is accepted, and it's very broadly understood to be part of the game. And of course, everybody likes a success story, but there isn't the social penalty for failure that you find in certain cultures. I mean, the best example are probably some of the Asian cultures, Japan, China. I mean, failure is not an option. You do not fail. And when you're not willing to fail, you don't take risk. And when you don't take risk, you don't get big rewards.
I think if there is one victory that India as a country has sort of scaled in the last decade or so, it is accepting failure positively. So if some young student of IIT Madras were to put on their resume, I tried this startup for 3 years and this is what I did, I think it would be looked at positively by a future employer or whatever be their next venture. One last question on this whole startup ecosystem. In India, there is a thriving venture capital ecosystem that is investing in thousands and thousands of startups, but there are also thousands of startups that are bootstrapped, that try to grow, sort of by themselves, and there's a small cultural element to that as well. That I want to grow my business the way I like it. One of India's largest software product manufacturers falls in this category. Do you see this brand of startup in Israel, or what's your view on this?
I know a few that have grown that way. It's hard, and it is only possible in very specific areas, because software, for example, is a good example because it's relatively quick to develop and you can start selling. You cannot bootstrap a biotech startup.
Sure.
You cannot bootstrap a medical device. You can't bootstrap many of the deep tech companies. I mean, look at quantum computing. You can't, what are you going to sell? You've got nothing to sell for the first few years. It's very research intensive. So in some areas, yes, you can do that. I know a few of those. And of course, like anything else, you minimize the risk, but you also minimize the rewards, because organic growth is defined by and limited by the pace at which you can grow. It's not a bad thing. But you typically would then end up with something that was more like a small business than like a real startup.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to differentiate, the two categories of startups. I think that's a good place to leave the discussion on startups. Let's move on to tech transfer. You did that for a living for some time. You did that very well for Hebrew University. Tell us how that whole effort started. What was it structurally that helped you succeed? And then we'll go deeper on that.
I'll maybe, with your permission, give a couple of sentences by way of background, because Israel has been doing tech transfer for longer than any other country in the world. And it's important.
Before we go very far, let's define tech transfer. What are all the things we're going to talk about?
Well, when I talk about tech transfer, and thank you for that question, because I've come across very different definitions. We're talking about, if you will, the classic definition of taking technology that was developed in academia and commercializing it into a product by either licensing to a bigger company or licensing to a small startup, often founded by the people who developed the technology.
Okay.
So it is the transfer of technology from academia to industry.
Okay.
And that's the world I'm going to talk about here, because sometimes you talk about, bringing technology to developing countries, and that's not what I'm looking at here.
Good.
The classic, if you will, tech transfer has been done in Israel since the late 50s. And we were world pioneers in that area. And the first tech transfer company in the world, actually, was created at the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel in 1959. Yissum, which I ran many years later, was created before I was born. Yissum was established in 1964 at the Hebrew University, and then the others in the 70s and 80s at all the other universities in the country. When you consider that the US legislation that laid the basis for technology transfer, which is known as the Bayh-Dole Act, and I think you've maybe discussed it on this podcast before, the Bayh-Dole Act was enacted in 1980. So we were there over 20 years before, doing tech transfer in much the way that is defined in the US legislation and also in our own and most countries around the world, which means the technology that's developed within the university by anyone from the stage of being a graduate student and all the way up to tenured professors. So we exclude undergrads. And that, again, is common in most countries. But graduate students and up, that technology is owned by the university. In the same way that if you develop a technology at a company that you work for, it's owned by the company.
Yes.
So it's the same thing. It's actually the same law. And what the university then does is it has, and again, Israel here is a little different from other countries. We don't do this through an office of the university. The universities have established separate companies. These are for-profit companies. They are owned by universities. They are managed separately. They're managed professionally. They're managed by people who are not university employees but are employed directly by those companies. And they operate under a contract with the university. And the contract with the university specifies that ownership of all intellectual property will be held by the company. The company will pay for the intellectual property. It'll undertake all the activities necessary to commercialize the intellectual property. And the two aspects to that, which I think are similar to what you have here, if the company decides not to take on a particular piece of technology, not to protect it in terms of intellectual property, that then goes back to the researcher. And when technology is commercialized and it is successful and the money starts flowing in, we have a system of dividing the proceeds. Most go to the researchers. So in the case of the Hebrew University, that's 60% to the researchers, of which 40% goes to them personally, 20% goes to them for research, whatever research they want to do, and the remaining 40% goes to the company, split with the university under a certain scale. So that's how it works. The advantage of that is you've got professional business people running the transfer of technology, the negotiations with industry, dealing with the intellectual property. The board of the company is made up of industry experts. There is some representation for the university, but that varies. At the Hebrew University, which is one of the most successful in tech transfer, the university representation is a minority. There's one professor, there's one, typically the CEO, and that's it. In other places, stronger connection with academia. Weizmann Institute has a vice president whose job it is to be the chair of the tech transfer arm. So a much closer relationship. But they still operate as a for-profit company with its own P&L, and that is important because that lets you make business decisions based on what the real world needs and not based on academic politics.
Let's talk about these business decisions. Let's look at all the different forms of decisions that a company like Yissum needs to make. Let's start with the first. A professor comes to you with a disclosure. Now it's Yissum's decision whether to patent it or not in the first place.
Correct.
That's the first business. Let's talk about that. What's under the hood with that process?
Well, what you're looking for, and again, I think that's true globally, what you're looking for is something that you think might have commercial value. And here I differentiate between, there's a lot of fantastic research that's blue sky. It needs to happen. It doesn't need to be patented. It can't be patented, okay? Not everything can be patented. You know
Sure.
that. But that I set aside. That, after all, is one of the main reasons we have universities, is for the creation and expansion of knowledge. But if we look at technologies that are what you could broadly put under translational research, okay? Things that can eventually have a commercial use, then we look at those things. My own personal view, and that's also what I did, is that we need to be very lenient in the initial protection.
Okay.
Okay? Because I believe that we don't know what could be useful in a few years' time. We need to be willing to give, if you will, think of it as a funnel, a very broad funnel at the early stages. Let's give this some basic protection, and there are ways of getting relatively inexpensive protection for a period of time, and explore further during that time. See what we have to do to make this more attractive to investors and to the market, to partners, and so on. Sometimes you have to do a little more research. Sometimes you have to do something, to make it more specific, be it to build a model or to do some preclinical work or whatever. There are things that you can do.
Sure.
So at that point, when it was me running the company, but I would make sure one of my people, and they were the business development staff, were assigned specific areas. So someone was responsible for agriculture, and someone was responsible for physics, and someone chemistry, and so on and so forth. They would work with the researchers to build a plan of what had to be done within that first,
So
let's say,
these
year
were
to 18
employees,
months.
these people were employees of Yissum, but
Yes.
had some domain knowledge.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. You have to have domain knowledge. You can't. Those are if you will, the people who have one leg on either side. Okay. Typically, they'll have a PhD.
Sure.
They'll have industry experience. They'll have some understanding of what the world needs, and they will be able to really walk hand in hand with the professors in the initial phases of developing whatever that may be.
Those people can't be cheap.
They're not.
How do you...
Well, again, I was very privileged. I was running a profitable company. But, people do things for different reasons.
Okay.
And I think that those of us who are curiosity-driven and who want to be part of really creating the next great thing are, I didn't make as much, not nearly as much as I was making as a venture capitalist.
Sure.
But it was exciting to me for other reasons.
Yeah, you were serving a bigger purpose.
Yeah,
there.
it's almost public service. It's not, because you do get paid for what you do, but
it
it's
is
a type of
ser-
public service.
Yeah, all public servants get paid. Nothing wrong in that in itself.
No, I'm just saying it's a type of public service. So you can find these people.
Sure. So the second kind of business decision is maintenance of a patent. Okay.
That's a more difficult decision.
Okay. What processes helped you there?
What we did is establish, and the key word here is process. You need to have a very transparent process because you need to be fair to everyone. And you can't just wake up one day and say, "Ooh, we need to make a decision about this patent. We've spent enough. Nobody's interested. Bye-bye." It doesn't work. It's also not right, in terms of not the right way to do things. And because, of course, every professor thinks that their technology is the cat's whiskers, this is what's going to change the world. And if you didn't commercialize it, it's because you, the commercialization company, are useless. I've heard that so many times. Not always true, but it's their point of view. So in order to make sure that everyone is as happy as can be, because happy, I'm not sure they always are, but as happy as can be, you have a process that's very transparent. You have eventually a committee that gets together on a regular basis that includes our own business people. It does include the vice president of research for the university. Sometimes we get external opinions, and we do have to have made an effort. I have to hold my staff accountable. It can't be that this comes up, a year or two have passed, you've passed the provisional stage and the PCT and so on, you have to come to, where the big bucks are being paid, and say, "Oh, oops, we didn't have time for this." That doesn't fly. You need to have made an effort. And the professors have a role to play. They have a role to play because, in my experience, after all, it is the professor who goes to the conferences, who knows better than anyone else what's happening in their field, who will be approached by people who may be interested, companies who may be interested. This has to be a joint effort. They don't have to do the business work. That's the company's job. But they do have to be a partner in all of this. And if you don't use that, then you're missing out, because there's a lot that they can bring to the table. So it's always it's a sort of dance, if you will. And I can think of occasions where we had to make decisions that were unpopular, but on the whole, I think we were able to get to most of those decisions with an understanding that it was the right thing to do.
We professors seem to sometimes sort of go under a blanket and think we know it all, including selling patents. Like, I have colleagues who are really good at it, but not everybody needs to be good at marketing their intellectual property. What's that conversation like? You said it's like a dance with the professor being an equal partner, and they may be more well known in their field. How do you walk this fine line?
Well, as you say, it is a very fine line. And I think at the end of the day, like anything, it's a people skill.
Yeah.
It's a people skill, and it is. Look, sometimes it doesn't work. I'll be the first to say sometimes it doesn't work. But most of the time, when there's mutual respect, it works. And
Okay.
when there's mutual respect and they understand that you're actually bringing something to the table, and there are a lot of other things that we used to do, which I think might be worth mentioning just as bullet points, but listen, in order to really operate successfully in this field between academia and industry, you need to constantly be reaching out on both sides. Mm-hmm. You need to reach out within the university. And we did that. I actually would go out and I myself would go and meet with the deans, and I'd go and meet with the senior staff. I would send my people out physically into the faculties to walk around the labs and see what was going on a regular basis. It was a regular plan. We would have industry experts and bring them in, on a regular basis, whether monthly, every other month, quarterly, to update ourselves on what was happening in the business, in the different worlds that we were operating in, which in the case of the Hebrew University were very broad, because the Hebrew University at that time, and I think even to this day, did about a third of all academic research in Israel. So it was a broad plate, if you will. And I think that when the professors see that you're working for them, then that relationship, that dance, if you will, becomes a little more synchronized.
Good way to put it. Thank you. The last part of this puzzle, the last business decision, is the actual art of closing a deal. Mm-hmm. to borrow a famous person's phrase, and to really go to sort of negotiate and get that deal done. That's squarely on Yissum's plate?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And what was that last bit of the process like?
And an important point to mention is that the only patents that we look at keeping or not keeping are those that didn't get commercialized. So hopefully that deal has happened. Once the deal has happened, then they pay for the IP and the IP gets funded. There's no problem. So I failed to mention that, but it should be said that you only look at stopping, the continued funding of IP if you haven't succeeded in commercializing it for a certain number of years. Okay, but let's go to those that do get commercialized. Most of the deals are licensing deals. In fact, they're all licensing deals, but most of them are licensing deals to existing companies, larger companies. And those will typically have several components. There'll be a licensing fee. There'll be a royalty. The royalty is very important because although it looks like a small percentage, it's what makes big money over time. If it's a startup that's licensing it, sometimes there'll be an equity component because they can't afford to pay a big fee. Sometimes there'll be a consulting agreement for the professor as part of this deal, which goes directly to them. They get the money. Again, very common if it's a smaller company. Bigger companies maybe don't need it so much because they have their own people. But those are the types of components that you will get. Sometimes there'll be an R&D agreement, so a sponsored R&D that goes to the professor's lab, very often because the licensee wants access to some future developments. Sometimes there'll be a service component, so they want the lab to do certain things for them. Not R&D, but actual, whatever. Best examples you can give are, for example, formulation or beta testing of certain things that you can do in a faster way in a lab than in a company. But those are the types of components you'd have. The main ones being, the license, the royalties, the licensing fee. And those are deals that you negotiate. One of the things that I did actually was create a series of standard agreements with some clauses that, of course, could change. And we published those, the standard agreements, and created a transparent, if you will, playing field where people knew what to expect. And then my people who were negotiating the deals knew what they could, change, where they had leeway. And if they hit a wall, they'd come to me or whoever could make the decision. But I think that that's a good way to go about it because it's a large volume of agreements.
You talked of, royalty over time versus one-time licensing fee upfront. What was philosophically, how do you parse this? If a client came to you and said, I want to do a low upfront license fee, but I'm okay with a little bit more on the royalty side of things.
Listen, in the end, it's a negotiation. And like any deal, you look at what's best for your side and you find the right balance. I simply mentioned that there was a time, and also it varies by country, but there was a time where people were enamored of the idea of setting up startups. Now, most university-based technologies are not suitable for startups. They're more suitable to go into a company that has a broader portfolio. When you set up a startup, it can't pay, it's only royalty-based, it wants to give you equity, you find yourself with a large portfolio of companies that you can't continue to fund because you're a tech transfer, you're not a venture capital fund. So you find the right balance. Personally, if I believe in the technology, I'm happy with a back-ended deal. I'm not looking to make the money up front.
Let's talk about the structure of Yissum, okay, which I think is new to several universities thinking in India.
Okay.
The fact that it is a for-profit arm at an arm's length from the university, but owned by the university.
Right.
Okay. Describe what was the thinking there and why do you think it should be a for-profit now?
You're dealing, and again, the structure, well, I didn't invent the structure, but I believe that it is one of the reasons that Israel's been relatively good at tech transfer. Because you've got the best of all worlds. You've got exclusive access to the ownership, in fact, of the technology. You know, all of the many patents that were done during my time. I actually, they've got my signature on them as the owner of the intellectual property. So you've got all of the intellectual property. You've got professionals doing the work who want to do that work, who know the business, and you've got the best chance of bringing money back into the university. I mean, when I say for profit, yes, it's run as a for profit entity, but that money flows back into the university. You're bringing money back in. And it's the ideal cycle of tech transfer, right? The public funding comes in, you fund the research, you commercialize the research, the upside comes back in, funds more research, etc., etc. It's a cycle of virtue.
Yes, for sure. And the other idea that one of these entities can service multiple universities.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in that. Running a good professional tech transfer organization is expensive. And there is a surprisingly tiny number of universities around the world that make enough money on tech transfer to actually support a structure like that. I mean, we were one of those, but most universities don't. Usually you don't see it because they're not run separately. They don't have a separate P&L. So you're not really paying for the employees. But if you do look at it separately, those are the numbers. Now, you can set up a professional group of people that will service a number of universities and institutions. You can also, which is something I did as CEO of Yissum, offer services to other institutions. I took on another university. I took on a hospital nearby that we had academic ties with. And then all they have to do is maybe pay for a fraction of a person's time. And we were able to take on the initial costs and then, be reimbursed when the invention was commercialized. Everybody wins. We would have a larger portfolio, they would get top-notch service, and and that's how it works. Eventually, if they grow and they want to have their own person, fine. But I think that is a structure that's worth looking at. And I'll say something else. Strangely, when you look at tech transfer, you can service different institutions because they don't really compete with each other.
Right.
And it's something people don't often think of. They think there's competition. There might be competition between universities in other areas, but when you're looking at tech transfer, you're commercializing the research that's already been done.
Yeah.
There's no competition.
And were the clients on the buy side of your IP mostly multinational companies or were they Israeli companies? And what fraction of the total deals were startups? Rough, I mean, high level numbers.
I'd say high level numbers 80-20 licensing versus startups.
Okay.
In terms of the clients, I'd say a mix of multinationals, of local companies. We would also actively offer technologies to potential licensees. And what we would do, and done this quite a few times and it was successful, is contact a multinational, ask them what they were looking for, create what I used to call a reverse roadshow. So they would come to us, and we would have a whole day of showing them technologies in the areas that they had specified. But that requires work because you need to prepare and really show them things that make sense. And we had, for example, a very successful company come out of something like that. Company that I brought in, a very large European-based multinational, and they ended up actually focusing on a technology that was still very early. We started with an R&D agreement. Then there was a joint venture created. which they funded, and and eventually, some years later, they acquired the whole thing. But it was a very, very successful enterprise that started because we did this work to find them and to offer them a whole range of technologies at different stages of maturity.
Very nice. Let's move on and talk to students. And what sort of careers can one look forward to in this broader space of IP law and tech transfer, innovation and entrepreneurship? Innovation and entrepreneurship is a piece in itself. Let's start with that. If a young student wants to get into innovation, to be innovative and eventually build a career on that, what are some skills and traits you would suggest they should come with?
I may surprise you a little here, but I think that what they need to do is follow their dreams in exploring different areas of expertise. You have an engineering student. They like music. I'm not saying go be a professional musician. I am saying don't give up on that. It develops an additional skill set. So I'll put it slightly differently. What I'm trying to say is we're moving into a world where this multiple skill set is going to be more and more important. And your ability to draw on your skill sets and interests in areas beyond just the one area you've studied are going to make you more desirable in the workplace. So that's one thing that, to me, the whole area of creativity and multidisciplinary skill sets is something that people should focus on from university and moving on in life. Be curious, learn new things. You don't have to go to university to learn new things after you've graduated. There are many, many other ways of acquiring skills, but don't stop learning. It goes back to the beginning of our conversations. Don't stop learning. You ask me about getting into the world of innovation. The world of innovation is very broad. I think that, and this was true for me, it's true for a lot of people I know, there's value in spending a few years at a large organization.
Okay.
There is value in that. I'm not saying spend your entire life in a large organization. I think we've moved away from the time where you could spend your entire career in one company. It really hardly ever happens anymore. But if you've got an interesting offer in a large corporation, it's not a bad place to start because it'll give you an understanding of how big business thinks. And big business thinks in a different way than small businesses and startups. And big business will always be your partner. And I know that for me, when I moved from the headquarters of Novartis to venture capital, and I found myself working with these tiny companies as a board member, as active chairperson, whatever, different roles, and then negotiating on their behalf with the same sorts of companies that I came from, I was a lot more effective than anyone else because I knew how it worked. Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing I think that's worthwhile. It's very hard to move directly out of university into venture capital, unless you happen to chance upon, through whatever connections, some sort of entry-level analyst position. But by and large, venture capital firms are top-heavy, and they don't have many entry-level positions. They are not so much in the business of developing talent. They're in the business of hiring people who can offer something already. So don't think that you're not skilled. Just understand that you might get to that at a slightly later stage.
Sure.
Of course, if you have a technology that you're passionate about, you've developed something, you've worked with your professor on something, there's no harm in trying to develop a startup. The worst thing that will happen is you'll fail. The best thing that will happen is you'll succeed. And the sure thing that will happen is you'll learn something. So that's another avenue. I think that it's very important. To me, one of the things I actually like less is people who try to work in innovation without having something of their own to bring. Some world experience, business experience, research experience. Then it becomes, you're sort of rehashing ideas that you've been taught. It's better to get there when you have something of your own to bring into the mix. and when you can bring together these different skill sets. Now, there are things you need to learn. There are things you need to learn to do. You need to be able to speak. You need to be able to present. I'm sure you do some of that at the university as well. You need to be able to make a point. It's become even more important in this day and age because you're moving from being, say, an engineer or a researcher or a technical person into working in the world of business. You need to be able to cut a deal as well. You need to be able to make a point. It's become even more important in this day and age because you're moving from being, say, an engineer or a researcher or a technical person into working in the world of business. You need to be able to cut a deal. At the end of the day, I'm a deal maker. When I ran Yissum, I signed 1,200 deals. It's a big number, but and of course I didn't negotiate them all myself. I had to sign them, but the point being, that's this world. It's a world of doing deals. It's a world of, finding the right partners. Any small company will have multiple relationships. Those are multiple deals. So I think that, I know it's not one answer, but any of these avenues will get you to the point where you can move in. Of course, you can go, most large corporations today have an innovation arm. They'll have some sort of division. It used to be only business development. Now business development is a less common term, but you always hear about innovation. They'll have a hub, they'll have an accelerator, they'll have an incubator. It's fine, and if you can have an opportunity even to do an internship in one of those, great way in. But try and build your skill set so that when you come to do one of these things, you have some experience to offer.
People value that.
People value that.
Far more than probably degrees on paper.
Well, degrees on paper are a great starting point.
Correct.
But you need to do something with that degree. You need to go out and get some work experience. It's not so much the case today, but certainly when I did my my master's in business, in order to do an MBA in any of the top schools, you had to have had at least 2 or 3 years of work experience.
Sure.
And I believe that the same is true in a slightly different way for the world of innovation and entrepreneurship, and entrepreneurship within, not being an entrepreneur, but working with entrepreneurs. Because you have to bring something of yourself that's more than just the ability to crunch numbers, or you have to be able to interact and to understand what they're going through, and so you can. And there are a lot of ways to acquire that sort of expertise. But I will, again, going back to the beginning of this answer, don't shy away from big companies, but understand that if you want to be eventually in this world, then you're going there for a limited period of time to do a job, for 2 or 3 years, and then look again at what your options are. And it is a good thing to do. It's not bad. It's actually extremely useful in the world of innovation.
Crisply, as a lawyer, talk to a young student wanting to get into intellectual property law. What's the excitement there?
I like intellectual property law, I have to say, because to me it encompasses so many different things. But that's actually a very clear career path. You want to be an intellectual property lawyer, find yourself an intellectual property law firm.
Most of these people tend to be global.
There's both. I don't know enough about the Indian landscape in intellectual property law, so I'm careful with what I say. But everywhere else I know, there are typically local firms. One thing about intellectual property law is there is a strong local component to it, because you have to operate by law in different countries. Very often, there's either a global firm that has offices in different places, or more commonly, an alliance of local firms. So they have partners, but are not part of the same firm. But definitely, you would then want to go and intern and start working in one of the best you can find intellectual property law firm, and take it from there. I'm sure that there are also intellectual property lawyers within the big corporations here in India. It's common around the world. That's another way of going in. Any of the big companies in areas that are technology related will have an in-house intellectual property arm as well. So that's another place you can start looking. And typically, again, big companies have opportunities for recent graduates because it's very hard. That first job is always the most difficult.
Sure, sure. Talk to parents now. In India, they tend to value stability in their young wards' careers. Is that something Israeli parents also I mean, how are they wired, and are they different? Are they the same? What would you tell them?
I think parents all over the world, we want the best for our children, right? And we all want our children to have happy and comfortable and fulfilling lives. And stability can be part of that. So I can understand that. Also, we have to understand that we come from a different generation. And we are the in-between generation. Our parents were maybe more stable in their work life. We certainly, for myself, I've moved between multiple types of work and career, and for my children, it depends on what opportunities stand before them. I think that we need to understand that we've moved away from the world of, having a job with one company for the rest of your life. I think that we need to understand and we need to let our children experiment and exercise their curiosity. And I think that you can encourage your children to look at the different aspects of what they're doing. I'll tell you, if you will, my little secret, the one question I always asked myself, and the one question I always tell young people who consult with me to ask themselves is not just what does this next opportunity give me, but what doors does this open for me for the next opportunity after that? Does this close something or does it open additional avenues for me? And it's not always difficult to answer, but many people don't tend to think in those terms. They're thinking, oh, I'm being offered this job, it's higher pay, I'm going to take it. But then, if you do that, then you close yourself in a very narrow area. What does that mean for 3 to 5 years ahead? As opposed to you've got another opportunity that gives you a different skill set and opens up another avenue. So I think that's true for the young people, and I think it's true for the parents as well. We have to take a deep breath and realize that I think at some point we can't control them anymore. We can just support them.
Good message to leave for our parents, all the parents in the audience to chew. Your closing thoughts, Nava. This has been a fascinating conversation already.
It's a brave new world. And if we thought it was a brave new world when we entered the workplace, it's braver and newer now. And I leave you with the thought of the only thing we know is that when our children reach the height of their careers, they'll be living in a very, very different world and a very different workplace from what we are in now. And the only thing I would encourage them to do is lifelong learning, is to follow whatever they find of interest because those skill sets will be useful, both in work and in life, and not to leave out creativity. Because if there's one skill that I think will always be useful, it is creativity. Not just the arts, but there's creativity in engineering, there's creativity in science, there's creativity in anything. Let yourself explore, let yourself think, and the future will be very exciting.
The future is indeed very exciting. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, helping us understand innovation the Israel way and helping us understand pieces of this puzzle from startup creation systems to tech transfer to how parents and young students should parse, the future in their heads. Thank you again. This has been another episode of the Professor Mahesh Podcast, your resource to help you make informed career decisions. Until we meet again, be well, do good, and keep in touch. Goodbye.